The Apache girl said, "My body is on fire, take off my dress." The cowboy was surprised. The wide, open land stretched endlessly, dotted with patches of dry grass and clusters of trees that had somehow survived the heat of the day. A lone cowboy rode slowly along the dusty trail, his horse's hooves kicking up small clouds of sand with each step. He was used to the quiet of the plains, the kind of quiet that could feel peaceful or lonely, depending on the day. Today, it felt heavy, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. He had been traveling for hours, moving cattle from one grazing area to another, his eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of trouble. The wind was warm but dry, carrying with it the scent of dust, grass, and something faintly sweet that he couldn't quite place. He shaded his eyes with his hand and squinted at a spot near the dry creek up ahead. At first, he thought it was just a pile of clothes left behind by someone passing through, but as he drew closer, he realized it was a person lying on the ground. The figure was small and delicate, with long, dark hair fanned across the dusty earth. Her body lay stiffly, and her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid movements. Something about her made him pause. He had seen many travelers and settlers in distress over the years, but there was a certain look in her eyes, even half-closed, that told him she was in serious trouble. Hesitation gripped him for a moment. He had grown up hearing stories about the tension between settlers and the Apache people who lived in the plains, and he didn't want to make a mistake. But his instincts, honed by years of life in the wild, told him that a person in danger needed help, no questions asked. Sliding off his horse, he approached carefully. "Hey there," he called softly, trying to sound calm and non-threatening. "Are you all right?" His voice carried across the still air, gentle but firm. The girl didn't respond, at least not in words. Her lips moved slightly, as if she was trying to speak, but no sound came out. He noticed her skin glistening with sweat, her face flushed, and a strange, almost feverish heat radiating from her. She was burning up, not from fire, but from some kind of illness or shock. The cowboy knelt beside her, careful not to startle her. He took off his hat and wiped his brow, feeling a wave of concern wash over him. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "We've got to get you out of this, son." He looked around for shade, but there was none to be found near the dry creek. The few trees nearby offered only tiny patches of relief. The heat of the late afternoon pressed down on them both, and he could feel his horse's restless movements behind him, sensing his tension. Gently, he touched her shoulder. "It's okay," he said again. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." Finally, she managed to lift her eyes, dark and wide, filled with panic and fear. Then she said something that made his heart stop for a moment. "My body, it's on fire," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Take off my dress." The cowboy froze. He wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. The words sounded shocking at first, but he quickly realized that she wasn't speaking out of embarrassment or shame. Her body was literally in distress. Her skin felt like it radiated heat, and the tension in her small frame made it clear that she was suffering in a way he had never seen before. He understood then that she was in danger, that her words were a desperate plea for relief from her burning body. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He had never been in a situation like this. He had treated wounded animals, fought off snakes, helped injured riders, but never someone so fragile and frightened. And yet, despite the strangeness of the moment, he knew what he had to do. Hesitation could cost her life. His respect for her dignity, didn't stop him from realizing that survival came first. Looking around, he found a clean piece of cloth in his saddlebag and a small amount of water. He shaded her face from the sun as best he could, and began to carefully loosen her clothing to allow her body to cool. Every movement was slow and deliberate. He spoke in calm, soothing words, telling her that she was safe, that he wouldn't hurt her, and that he was only trying to help. Her eyes never left his, a mixture of fear and relief washing over her face. The heat was intense. Sweat ran down both their faces, and the air seemed to press down with a weight that made each breath feel heavy. The cowboy poured small amounts of water on the cloth and dabbed her skin gently, feeling her tremble beneath his touch. He knew he couldn't stay here for long. The sun would soon dip, and the cold of night would come with it, but he also knew that rushing could make things worse. Patience, he reminded himself, was as important as action. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The girl's breathing gradually steadied as he continued his careful ministrations. She began to relax slightly, leaning against him for support, though he never moved too close. He respected her space, aware that trust needed to be earned, not forced. Even in this moment of crisis, he thought about her bravery. She had been alone in the harsh environment, and her body had borne more than most could endure. Finally, as the sun began its slow descent behind the distant hills, the first signs of relief appeared. Her skin cooled enough for her to speak without pain, and her trembling lessened. She whispered words of thanks in her language, which he didn't fully understand, but the tone carried gratitude. He smiled gently and nodded, understanding that even without shared words, the meaning was clear. She had survived the worst of the sun and heat thanks to someone who had chosen to act rather than hesitate. The cowboy helped her sit up and guided her into the shade of a nearby tree. He offered her more water, which she accepted eagerly, drinking it in small, careful sips. He stayed by her side, knowing that this moment of vulnerability required more than quick action. It required patience, respect, and steady care. He realized that heroism wasn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes, it was about being present when someone needed help the most. As the sky deepened into shades of red and purple, the cowboy looked down at the girl and felt a quiet sense of relief mixed with awe. He didn't know her story, her past, or her people, but he knew that he had made a difference in her life today. The plains were vast and unforgiving, but moments like this reminded him that compassion could cross any divide, bridge any fear, and save a life. And in that moment, the bond between a stranger and someone in desperate need of help was formed, silent but strong, under the wide, endless sky of the plains. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the plains, but the heat still lingered heavily. In the air, the cowboy stayed close to the Apache girl, making sure she remained stable and comfortable. He could see that her breathing was slower now, but her hands trembled, and her face still held the ghost of panic. He didn't rush her, understanding that fear and pain often take longer to ease than physical wounds. The quiet around them was broken only by the distant rustle of the grass and the soft creak of his horse shifting its weight nearby. The girl's eyes met his again, wide and searching. She seemed unsure whether he was friend or foe, whether this stranger would truly help or simply turn away. The cowboy smiled gently, trying to convey reassurance without words, because he knew that in her world trust was earned, not given freely. Slowly, she whispered, her voice trembling, "My body, it feels like fire. Please take off my dress." At first he froze, unsure what she truly meant. His mind raced, thinking through all the possibilities: fever, heat stroke, poison, or an allergic reaction. He realized quickly that her words were a desperate call for relief from whatever was causing her body to burn. It wasn't about embarrassment or shame. It was about survival. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that helping her safely was more important than worrying about appearances or social discomfort. Every second counted, and the heat of the plains would only make things worse if he hesitated. He moved carefully, letting her see his hands and actions clearly so she wouldn't feel threatened. "All right," he said calmly, "I'm just going to help you cool down. You're safe with me." He reached for the clean cloth he had brought earlier and gently dabbed at her sweat-soaked skin, starting with her arms and neck. The girl flinched at first but allowed him to continue when she realized he meant no harm. He could feel the heat radiating off her body, much higher than normal, and it made his chest tighten with concern. The cowboy knew a little about heat stroke and fever from tending to sick animals and occasional travelers in the plains. He remembered that cooling the body gradually, offering water, and keeping the person in the shade could mean the difference between life and death. The girl's thin frame made him realize how vulnerable she really was. Every muscle in her body was tense, and her small hands clutched at the edges of her clothing as if it offered her some protection, even though it was burning her. He gently helped her loosen the outer layers of her dress, only enough to allow the heat to escape. He moved slowly, speaking softly in a way that was almost more about rhythm than meaning. "Easy, just breathe. We'll get you through this," he murmured, hoping the words would offer comfort as much as the actions. The girl's eyes welled with tears, not from shame, but from relief and exhaustion. She felt the cool cloth against her skin and the slight breeze that rustled through the trees. For the first time in what seemed like hours, her body felt even a little lighter. Time stretched on as he continued. The cowboy alternated between offering sips of water and dabbing her skin with the wet cloth, careful not to make sudden movements that might frighten her. He thought about the stories his father had told him as a boy about survival on the plains, about how the land could be unforgiving, but how human kindness could save lives. He realized now that he was living one of those lessons firsthand. He had not expected to find someone in such distress today, but fate had placed her in his path, and he knew he could not turn away. As he worked, he tried to piece together what might have caused her condition. Her movements suggested she had been running or escaping from something. Her skin was sunburned in patches, and her hair was tangled and dusty. He suspected she had been traveling for some time under harsh conditions. Perhaps she had encountered poisonous plants or insects, or maybe the scorching sun had overwhelmed her body. Whatever the cause, the immediate concern was to stabilize her, and he focused all his attention on that. Minutes passed, each one feeling longer than the last. The girl's breathing grew steadier, and her trembling began to subside, but her eyes remained wide and alert, as if expecting danger at every moment. The cowboy realized that her fear was as intense as her physical pain. She had been alone in the harsh landscape, and anyone in her situation would be scared. He didn't rush her. He stayed by her side, keeping a careful watch, letting her set the pace of recovery. Occasionally, she would murmur a few words in her language, and he would nod, even though he didn't understand. The tone of her voice, filled with gratitude and caution, was enough. It told him she knew he was helping, that she was beginning to trust him. That trust, fragile but growing, was perhaps the most important thing he could earn right now. Without it, any further attempts to care for her might fail. The cowboy's thoughts wandered briefly to the risks he was taking. He was in unfamiliar territory, helping someone from a culture he didn't fully understand. A single mistake could lead to misunderstanding or conflict, but he reminded himself that life was more important than fear. Here was a human being, suffering and vulnerable, and he had the knowledge and ability to help. That choice, to act with care and respect, defined him more than any caution or fear ever could. Eventually, the girl's body began to cool. The cloth he had been using became damp and warm from the heat, but he didn't stop. He knew that this process required patience. The sun continued its slow descent, bathing the plains in softer, warmer light, and the wind began to carry a slight chill. The first hint of relief appeared on her face, a faint softening of the tension in her eyes. She no longer clutched at her clothing. Instead, she allowed her hands to rest loosely in her lap, showing that she trusted him enough to let go, even slightly. By the time the sky had turned a deeper shade of orange and the shadows stretched longer across the land, the cowboy noticed a marked difference in her condition. Her breathing was calmer, her pulse steadier, and her eyes, though still wary, showed recognition and understanding. The initial shock had passed, replaced by quiet gratitude and a cautious relief. He smiled, but carefully, knowing she was still fragile. He helped her shift slightly to a more comfortable position under the tree, offering water again and checking for any signs of ongoing distress. She accepted, sipping slowly, and even managed a small smile, a tiny, precious victory in what had been a long, frightening ordeal. The cowboy realized that moments like these were rare, fleeting, but profoundly important. He had no idea who she was, where she came from, or what would happen next, but he knew that in this moment, she had survived because he chose to act rather than hesitate. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of pink and purple in the sky. The plains, once harsh and unforgiving under the blazing sun, now seemed calm and protective. The cowboy stayed by the girl's side, his hand resting lightly on the saddlebag, ready to offer assistance if she needed it. He thought about the courage it must have taken for her to survive alone, and he marveled at her resilience. At the same time, he felt a quiet pride in himself, not pride in bravado or strength, but in having the patience, compassion, and respect to help someone in need. As night approached, the air cooled and the sounds of the plains changed. Crickets chirped, and distant owls called to each other. The girl's breathing was now steady enough that he could allow himself a small moment to reflect. He understood that the immediate danger had passed, but the journey was far from over. She still needed safety, shelter, and care, and he would have to help her reach those things. But for now, he allowed a sense of calm to settle over them both, knowing that the first and most crucial step, saving her from the burning heat, had been accomplished. The cowboy sat quietly beside her, listening to the gentle movements of the plains around them. The tension that had gripped the air all afternoon began to dissolve. The girl, though still weak and wary, seemed to sense that he was not a threat, and that trust, however tentative, was beginning to form. The plains could be harsh and cruel, but they could also teach lessons in resilience, understanding, and compassion. And in that quiet moment, under the fading light of the day, both the cowboy and the Apache girl understood something unspoken, that even strangers could share humanity in its purest form. As the first stars began to twinkle in the evening sky, the plains seemed to settle into a calm hush. The sun had disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving a soft twilight that painted everything in muted shades of blue and purple. The cowboy stayed close to the Apache girl, his presence steady and reassuring, though his mind was busy with thoughts. He realized that her recovery from the heat and panic was only the first part of the challenge. The bigger question now was how to keep her safe, comfortable, and alive through the night. The girl sat under the sparse shade of a tree, her breathing slow and even but her hands still shaking slightly. She seemed exhausted, not just physically but mentally. He could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders were hunched as if she were guarding herself from an invisible threat. The cowboy knew that moments of fear like this could leave a person wary and defensive, and he wanted to show her that she had nothing to fear from him. Yet he had to be careful. One wrong move, one sudden gesture could make her panic all over again. He spoke gently, careful to choose his words in a way that was calming rather than commanding. "You're safe now," he said. "The sun is gone. You don't have to worry about the heat anymore. We'll get you through this night." She looked at him, her dark eyes wide and searching. There was a mixture of uncertainty and gratitude in them. She tried to speak, but hesitated, struggling to find the right words in a language she doubted he would understand. The cowboy nodded encouragingly, letting her know that silence was okay, and that he could wait for her to gather her courage. Even in the quiet of the evening, the cowboy's senses were alert. He listened to the sounds of the plains, the rustle of small animals in the grass, the distant call of an owl, the faint creak of his horse shifting nearby. These noises reminded him that the wilderness was never truly still, that danger could always appear unexpectedly. He kept his hands free and ready to act, but he didn't let his alertness show in a way that would alarm the girl. Every movement was slow, deliberate, and intentional, designed to reassure her rather than startle her. The girl finally spoke in broken words, her voice soft and hesitant. The cowboy caught a few phrases he recognized: fire, pain, alone, and though he didn't understand the full meaning, he could sense her story through her tone and gestures. He realized that she had been traveling alone, likely for days, through harsh terrain and unforgiving sun. Her body had suffered from exhaustion, heat, and perhaps fear itself. He felt a deep surge of empathy. He had known hardship, but he had never faced it quite like this, alone and vulnerable on the open plains. Slowly, he offered her more water, guiding the cup carefully to her lips. She drank in small, careful sips, clearly not used to trust. Her hands shook as she held the cup, but she allowed him to support it for her. He realized that in this moment, trust was as important as physical relief. Without trust, she might resist his help, and that could cost her life. His patience and steady presence were crucial. He reminded himself that human connection, even in silence or through broken words, could save a life as much as clean water or shade could. After some time, he helped her adjust her position, leaning slightly against the tree. He offered a clean piece of cloth for her to sit on, keeping her away from the dusty ground, and gently fanned her with a folded hat to bring a small breeze. Every gesture, no matter how simple, was meant to show care without overstepping boundaries. He understood that her comfort was not only physical but emotional. She had been alone, scared, and in pain, and the memory of that could linger even after her body cooled. He thought about the irony of the situation. Here he was, a man used to life in the wild, strong with knowledge of survival, sitting beside a young girl who had been through far more than he had imagined. And yet, despite the danger and the unfamiliarity of their worlds, they had found a shared moment of understanding. Her body had been in literal pain, and now her mind needed reassurance. He realized that helping someone was more than tending to the obvious injury. It was about reading their emotions, anticipating their fears, and acting with respect and care. Hours passed slowly. The sky darkened completely, and the first cool air of night began to settle over the plains. The cowboy noticed that the girl's movements were more relaxed, though she still flinched at sudden sounds. He quietly moved his horse a little farther away so that it would not startle her, but he kept it within sight. He used this time to observe her closely, noting the slight paleness returning to her face, the steadier rise and fall of her chest, and the small signs of comfort in her posture. Every small improvement felt like a victory. He could see that she was still frightened, still unsure of her surroundings, but he also noticed something remarkable. Her gaze, once filled with panic, now occasionally met his with a flicker of trust. She allowed him to brush dust from her hair, let him adjust the cloth beneath her, and even nodded faintly when he spoke softly. These small gestures were monumental in their significance. He realized that he was not just saving her from the heat, he was helping her recover a sense of safety and hope, something that had likely been absent for a long time. The cowboy began to think about what had led her to this point. The plains could be merciless, but she must have had reasons to travel alone in such harsh conditions. Perhaps she had fled from danger. Perhaps she was seeking something important. Perhaps she had lost her family or companions. The details didn't matter as much as the fact that she was here now, alive, and needed help. He promised himself silently that he would do everything he could to keep her safe until she reached people who could care for her fully. As the night deepened, he noticed her shivering slightly, not from cold, but from the exhaustion that comes after intense suffering. He offered her the blanket he carried in his saddlebag, spreading it carefully over her shoulders. She accepted it without hesitation, leaning slightly against him for support, though maintaining a respectful distance. He understood that physical boundaries mattered, especially in a situation where trust was still fragile. Every step had to balance care with respect, protection with dignity. At one point, she whispered something that made him pause. He didn't understand the words, but the tone was almost apologetic, almost embarrassed. He smiled gently, shaking his head. "No need to apologize," he said quietly. "You've done nothing wrong, you're safe." Her eyes met his, a small flicker of relief passing over her features. He realized that for her, this had been more than a physical ordeal. It had been a moment of deep vulnerability, and the acknowledgement of her fear and pain mattered as much as the cooling water or shade he had provided. The night stretched on, quiet except for the natural sounds of the plains. The cowboy kept a careful watch, noting every small movement she made, every subtle sign of discomfort. He remained alert to any dangers, from wild animals to sudden weather changes, but his main focus was on her. He understood that surviving the night was as important as surviving the heat of the day. He spoke softly when necessary, offered water and comfort periodically, and remained a calm, steady presence, letting her recover at her own pace. By the early hours of the night, it was clear that she had regained some strength. Her breathing was steady, her body no longer radiated the unbearable heat, and she was beginning to relax in his presence. He could see the tension in her face easing, the slight softness around her eyes signaling a growing sense of trust. He realized that this was a turning point. The immediate danger had passed, and now she was ready to begin the journey of true recovery, both physically and emotionally. The cowboy felt a quiet pride in himself, not pride in strength or skill, but in patience, empathy, and understanding. He had faced a situation that could have been awkward or frightening, yet he had acted with respect and care. He knew that the bond formed in these quiet hours of fear and recovery would be remembered, even if neither of them spoke of it fully. Moments like this, he thought, defined true humanity. It was not heroism in action alone, but heroism in restraint, care, and compassion. As the stars glittered overhead and the plains seemed to settle into a serene silence, the cowboy and the Apache girl shared a quiet, unspoken understanding. No words were necessary to express the gratitude, relief, and tentative trust that had grown between them. The night was far from over, and the journey ahead would be challenging, but they had survived the first ordeal together. And in that moment, under the vast, star-filled sky, the cowboy realized that real courage is sometimes quiet, patient, and gentle, and that it can save a life in ways that brute strength never could. The plains had grown dark and still, with only the occasional rustle of grass or the distant call of a night bird breaking the quiet. The cowboy remained beside the Apache girl, watching her with careful attention. She was sitting under the small tree, wrapped loosely in the blanket he had offered earlier, her body no longer trembling from the heat but still tense with the memory of the ordeal. He knew the night was far from over. Surviving the heat had been only the first part. The next challenge was to understand why she had suffered so much and to ensure that nothing more threatened her. The girl's dark eyes flicked toward him, hesitant yet filled with a quiet curiosity. She spoke softly in her own language, and the cowboy listened carefully, trying to make sense of the broken words, the gestures, and the sounds that accompanied them. Though he could not understand her completely, the urgency and fear in her voice were clear. She seemed to be trying to explain something important, something that had caused her body to react so violently under the sun. The cowboy leaned closer, patient and attentive, letting her take the lead. He knew that rushing her or trying to guess could only frighten her further. Eventually, she began to point to various parts of her body, repeating the word for fire, and pointing to a red rash that had appeared along her arms and shoulders. The cowboy's heart sank as he realized that her burning sensation was not only from the sun, but from some kind of reaction, perhaps an insect bite or a poisonous plant she had come into contact with during her journey. His mind raced, thinking through the knowledge he had from the plains. Some plants could cause severe reactions if touched, and certain insects could inject venom that made the skin burn and swell. He nodded slowly, acknowledging her explanation even though he didn't understand the words fully. With great care, he examined her arms and legs, noticing patches of redness and tiny marks that hinted at insect bites. He kept his movements deliberate and gentle, showing that he meant no harm. "It's all right," he said softly. "We'll take care of it." She seemed to relax slightly at his words, realizing that he was listening and that he genuinely wanted to help. It was a small step, but it was significant. In her world, where outsiders often brought danger, this was trust being built moment by moment. The cowboy understood that immediate action was necessary. The burning sensation needed to be soothed, and the skin cooled to prevent infection or further pain. He soaked more cloths in water from his canteen and gently dabbed her skin, starting with the reddest areas. The girl flinched at first, but he spoke gently, reassuring her that he was only helping. Slowly, she leaned back, allowing him to continue, her initial fear beginning to melt into a tentative sense of safety. Every drop of water, every cooling touch, brought relief, and he could see her body gradually relaxing. As he worked, she tried to communicate more about what had happened. She pointed to a nearby area of brush and made motions as if she had been walking quickly, stumbling, and trying to escape something. The cowboy realized that she had likely been running or moving through rough terrain, which could explain her exhaustion and sunburn. He pieced together the story carefully in his mind. She had been alone, exposed to the harsh elements, likely bitten or scratched by something poisonous, and had struggled to find shelter. The human instinct to survive, to keep moving despite pain, had carried her this far, but it had also brought her to the edge of collapse. He sat quietly beside her, giving her time to rest while he kept watch. The night was cool, but the air was still filled with the faint warmth of the day that lingered in the ground and the grass. He encouraged her to sip water whenever she could, and he spoke gently to reassure her that she was safe. She responded with soft nods, her eyes meeting his with growing trust. It was in these quiet moments, when words were minimal and understanding was shown through actions, that the bond between them strengthened. After some time, he realized that her reaction had been more severe than he initially thought. It was not just the sun. It was a combination of heat, exhaustion, and some irritant from the plants or insects in the plains. He remembered tales from other travelers of children and women who had collapsed after contact with certain plants, how their bodies could burn and swell in response. The symptoms he observed, the red rash, the trembling, the intense heat she had felt, matched those stories. Acting with caution, he decided that the best approach was slow, steady cooling and hydration, coupled with careful observation. Throughout the night, he continued to speak in calm, soothing tones, offering comfort without pressing her for details. The girl gradually shared more through gestures, pointing at the sun and the plants, moving her hands in a way that suggested she had tried to protect herself, but had not known which plants were dangerous. He nodded in understanding, impressed by her resilience and carefulness even under such extreme circumstances. She had survived hours of exposure, exhaustion, and pain, and her spirit, though tired, remained strong. As the night deepened, he also realized the importance of keeping her morale up. Fear and uncertainty could sap energy just as quickly as heat or injury. He told small, simple stories about his life on the plains, about caring for animals, finding water in dry seasons, and traveling through the wilderness. At first, she listened with wide eyes, only half understanding, but gradually she began to respond with gestures and small smiles. Humor and storytelling, even in this fragmented way, brought a sense of normalcy and connection to the frightening situation she had endured. He also reflected on the dangers of the plains. Wild animals could come at night, and the open space provided little shelter. Yet he knew that his presence, combined with the girl's growing alertness, made them safer than either would be alone. He kept his horse close, ready to act if needed, but remained careful not to startle her. Every action was measured, showing her that he could be trusted. He had learned over years in the wilderness that calmness, patience, and respect often did more to protect someone than speed or force ever could. Hours passed, and gradually the girl's condition stabilized further. The redness on her skin began to fade, the burning sensation easing as the water and gentle care worked. Her breathing was steady, her trembling gone, and her eyes, though still wary, now reflected cautious confidence. The cowboy recognized that the immediate danger had passed. What remained was careful attention, trust, and understanding, the emotional and psychological recovery that would allow her to regain strength fully. By the time the moon rose high over the plains, casting a silver glow over the land, the girl began to speak more clearly, using broken words and gestures to describe what had happened. She had been walking through the desert, gathering herbs and food, when she had unknowingly touched a poisonous plant and been bitten by insects. Her body's reaction had been sudden and severe, a combination of sun, venom, and exhaustion. The cowboy listened carefully, piecing together the sequence of events. It was clear now why she had cried out for help so urgently, and why her body had felt like it was on fire. The cowboy nodded, understanding her completely now. He had faced many challenges on the plains, but this was different. This was not about danger from nature alone. It was about understanding, compassion, and careful action in a moment of life-threatening need. He reassured her in calm tones that she was safe, that she had survived the worst, and that he would help her reach a place where she could rest fully and recover. She leaned back against him slightly, her eyes closing in relief for a moment. Trust had been earned, and survival was now within reach. As the night continued, the cowboy reflected on what had occurred. The girl's ordeal had been terrifying, yet it had revealed incredible strength and resilience. Her ability to survive alone, her courage in seeking help despite fear, and her determination to continue despite pain were remarkable. He realized that true bravery is often quiet, unnoticed, and measured not in grand gestures but in small acts of endurance, trust, and hope. By the early hours before dawn, the girl's body was no longer in immediate danger. The rash had begun to subside, her skin had cooled, and her strength was slowly returning. The cowboy knew that daylight would bring new challenges, finding a safe place, accessing food and water, and reconnecting with her people. But for now, they had overcome the worst together. He allowed himself a quiet sense of relief, knowing that his patience, careful attention, and respect for her boundaries had made all the difference. Under the soft glow of the moon, they remained together quietly, two strangers bound by circumstance and compassion. The plain stretched endlessly around them, still vast and wild, but in this small corner under the tree, there was safety, understanding, and the quiet victory of survival. The cowboy knew that when morning came, he would help her take the next steps, guiding her to safety while respecting her dignity and independence. And the girl, though still exhausted, had begun to feel the first glimmers of hope that she would survive this ordeal. The first pale light of dawn began to stretch across the plains, painting the horizon with soft shades of pink and gold. The night had been long and quiet, broken only by the rustling of grass and the occasional distant call of birds waking with the new day. The cowboy remained beside the Apache girl, now more alert, though still exhausted from the ordeal she had endured. She had survived the burning heat, the terrifying pain, and the fear of being alone in the wilderness. But the day ahead held its own challenges, finding safety, shelter, and the reassurance that she was truly out of danger. The girl stretched slightly, testing the strength of her limbs. She felt a cautious sense of relief that the night had passed without incident. Her skin no longer burned, and the rash that had covered her arms and shoulders had begun to fade. She glanced at the cowboy, her dark eyes reflecting gratitude and curiosity. Slowly, she spoke a few words in her language, broken but meaningful. Though he didn't understand all the words, he recognized the tone. She was thanking him. He nodded gently, smiling. "You don't need to thank me. You're safe. That's what matters," he said softly. She seemed to understand, her eyes brightening with the comfort of his words. The cowboy helped her to stand, offering his arm for support. She accepted, moving cautiously but steadily, aware of the strength she had regained. They began walking together across the plains, the morning light revealing the vast, golden landscape around them. It was breathtaking but also intimidating. There were no roads, no settlements in sight, just endless grass and distant hills. He realized that their journey was far from over. She would need to reach her people, or at least a safe place, before exhaustion or unexpected danger could strike again. As they walked, the girl began to point to various directions, trying to communicate the location of her home or tribe. She gestured toward the distant hills, using hand signals and simple words to indicate familiarity. The cowboy nodded, understanding that her knowledge of the land was greater than his in some ways. He let her lead the way as much as possible, staying close to support her if she faltered. It was a delicate balance, guiding her towards safety while allowing her the independence to make decisions. Along the way, the cowboy noticed the marks of her journey. Her footprints were scattered with signs of fatigue. The grass was pressed down where she had fallen before. The soil was disturbed by hurried movements, likely from trying to find shelter or avoid danger. He realized the immense courage it had taken for her to survive alone, facing both the elements and uncertainty. He spoke softly to her as they moved, telling her to rest whenever needed, offering water and gently encouraging her to keep her strength. The girl responded with small gestures of acknowledgement. Occasionally, she would glance at him, her eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude, curiosity, and perhaps even something like admiration. It was remarkable, he thought, how trust had grown between two people who had been complete strangers just a day before. She had been terrified, yet she had allowed him to help, to guide her, to share in her most vulnerable moments. That trust was powerful, and he knew it was fragile, needing careful respect as they continued their journey. As they progressed across the plains, the cowboy realized that survival required more than strength and endurance. The girl's physical recovery was crucial, but so was her sense of hope and safety. He continued to speak softly, telling simple stories about life on the plains, about the animals he cared for, the rivers he found, and the quiet beauty of the desert landscape. At first she listened quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon, but gradually she began to respond with nods, smiles, and even a few gestures that matched his words. Communication, even when imperfect, was a lifeline. Hours passed, and the sun rose higher, warming the plains once more. The cowboy remained vigilant, careful to ensure that she did not overexert herself under the growing heat. He shaded her with his hat when possible, guided her around rough terrain, and offered encouragement when her steps faltered. Every small effort mattered. He understood that exhaustion could return quickly, and he was determined that she would not face it alone. At one point, they came across a small stream. The water was clear, flowing gently over smooth stones, and the sight of it brought immediate relief. The cowboy guided her to the edge, helping her to drink and wash the remaining sweat and dirt from her arms and face. She dipped her hands in the cool water, and he noticed a small smile flicker across her face, a moment of joy, simple but meaningful. The plains could be unforgiving, yet here was life, nourishment, and a brief sense of normalcy. The girl began to speak more openly now, pointing to plants, animals, and landmarks, sharing what she knew about the land around them. The cowboy listened, marveling at her knowledge and resilience. She had survived alone, navigating the challenges of the wilderness with intelligence and courage. He realized that her ordeal had not weakened her entirely. It had tested her, and she had endured. Her survival was a testament to strength, both physical and mental. As the day continued, they approached a small grove of trees, which offered shade and a sense of security. The cowboy encouraged her to rest, laying down the blanket once more. She sank into it gratefully, her body finally able to relax fully. The cowboy kept watch, scanning the horizon for any sign of danger while also giving her the space to recover. In this quiet moment, he reflected on the journey they had shared, the terror, the relief, the trust, and the understanding. It had been more than survival. It had been a human connection forged under the harshest conditions. Eventually, the girl began to point toward a direction that he assumed led to her home or the place where her people were. Her gestures were clear, confident, and filled with hope. He nodded, understanding that their journey was nearing its goal. The cowboy offered a reassuring smile. "We're almost there," he said gently. She looked at him with a mix of relief and gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. As they moved forward, the cowboy realized that this experience had changed him. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and moral hesitation, yet he had acted with patience, care, and respect. He had helped someone in need, not because he sought recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And in return, he had witnessed resilience, courage, and trust in its purest form. The plains, vast and often unforgiving, had taught him yet again that true strength lies not only in physical ability, but in compassion and understanding. By late morning, they began to see signs of human presence. A trail, smoke rising from a distant fire, the sound of voices carried by the wind. The girl's eyes lit up with recognition and hope. She quickened her pace slightly, and the cowboy stayed close, ready to support her if she faltered. Soon, they reached a small settlement of tents and dwellings where people began to notice them. The girl ran the last few steps, calling out in her language. Her family and community emerged, rushing to meet her, their faces a mixture of worry, relief, and gratitude. The cowboy stepped back, giving them space, but remained nearby to ensure she was safe. The reunion was emotional, filled with hugs, gestures, and expressions of relief. The girl's ordeal was over, and she was back where she belonged, surrounded by people who could care for her fully. Yet the cowboy's presence had been vital. Without his intervention, without his calm, careful attention, the outcome might have been very different. The girl turned to him, her eyes shining, and offered a gesture of thanks, something deeper than words, a silent acknowledgement of the life he had helped save. The cowboy smiled, tipping his hat in return. He had done what he could, and that was enough. In that moment, the plains seemed less vast and lonely, filled instead with the quiet satisfaction of a life saved, trust earned, and humanity honored. As he mounted his horse and prepared to leave, the cowboy looked back at the girl and her family. He realized that moments like these, rare and fleeting, were the ones that defined a life. Not the hardships faced alone, nor the challenges conquered in silence, but the small acts of courage, patience, and compassion that changed the course of someone else's story. He rode off slowly, leaving behind the settlement, the girl safe and alive, and carrying with him the quiet pride of a man who had chosen humanity above hesitation. The plains stretched endlessly before him, golden in the morning light, and the cowboy felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced fear, uncertainty, and the unknown, and through patience, respect, and care, he had helped someone survive. And in return, he had learned a lesson that would remain with him forever. That trust, compassion, and courage can turn strangers into allies, fear into safety, and despair into hope.